Episode 7. Russia, the Deep State, and the Cold War. Part 2. So, with everything from our previous episode in mind, the Cold War was a creation of the Deep State in Washington, which even then was under significant influence from a certain, obvious, Swedish entity. It was a creation by, among others, the Dulles brothers. Allen Dulles, like we said earlier, was the head of the CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles was the U.S. Secretary of State. They held on to these positions for a very long time. The brothers Dulles had a vested interest in the Cold War. It was not just because investor needed it. It was a situation that both parties benefited from. But then again, the Wallenbergs had some significant leverage over everyone, as they always do. The Dulles brothers used the Cold War to protect the clients of their law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, and not least the Wallenberg family, whom they defended against the Allies after the end of the war, in the Bosch affair. They used the Cold War to both increase their power and budgets, utilizing their high positions in the government. Let's use an example to illustrate how the deep state operates. When any reformist, democratically elected governments would emerge in Latin America, the Dulles brothers would see it as a threat to the holdings of their law firms' clients in these countries. These holdings, sometimes acquired with bribes to undemocratic governments, diverted the country's resources and wealth to the deep state. Not just into American hands. Remember, the deep state is a global phenomenon. Any reformist government would be declared either Marxist or communist, either way, istic. The CIA and the U.S. State Department would then work together to overthrow it, in order to place a dictator in power. The chosen dictator was of course already in bed with Washington, D.C. The Wallenbergs would at the same time act without being seen, and reap the rewards through their investor-controlled corporate interests. This was the method by which the deep state, through the Dulles brothers and the Wallenberg brothers, aimed to retain and increase their power and influence. Greed is indeed a nasty thing. Let's just frame it so everyone can understand. They lay their hands on the mining industry through their company called Atlas Copco. They control the telecommunications and surveillance through Ericsson. They could also control the power grid through their company ABB. The deep state also takes control of the narcotics industry through the intelligence community. Any so-called drug lord or cartel has always been allowed to operate, as long as they run the errands of the deep state. If there is any oil, it can be extracted through a company called Lundin Oil, which is a Swedish company, also connected to the deep state. Feel free to Google the following phrase: Lundin Oil and Sudan. You can also see if you can find the connection between Lundin Oil and Swedish politician and diplomat, Carl Bildt. Maybe you will also find out if he is connected to the Clinton Foundation and George Soros. It's such a small world, after all. Let's just say that when the deep state has successfully taken hold of a country in order to steal and control its natural resources, it's not that easy to get rid of them. Free and fair elections? Let's not kid ourselves. Seeing as Russia has the world's largest area and the most natural resources in the world, it's quite easy to understand why Russia has always been in the crosshairs of the deep state and the hidden enemy. The Cold War was, in other words, meaningless. Except for the interests of the Dulles brothers and the bank-controlled military-industrial complex. Yes, and for investor and the Wallenbergs of course, but by now that should be obvious. The Soviet government, unlike the US government today, had no world hegemonic aspirations. Stalin had declared socialism in one country and had purged the Trotskyists, meaning the communists who advocated for world revolution and creating religious polarization of a more long-term aspiring nature. Communism in China and Eastern Europe were not products of Soviet international communism. Mao Zedong was at least his own man to some extent, and the Soviet Union held Eastern Europe, while the Red Army expelled the Nazis. This created a buffer zone against a so-called hostile West. Let's take that one more time. There was never any real threat from the Red Army to invade Europe. Stalin declared socialism in one country and cleansed his Communist Party of Trotskyist and the so-called Jewish elements who preached the world revolution, all to maintain an underlying long-term polarization. This stalemate gave the military-industrial complex the ability to keep the war going for decades, and perhaps forever. Wallenbergs and the Dulles brothers must have been pleased. Maybe this would indeed have been the outcome. Endless wars. They surely had a long run of it, and it might truly have been everlasting if it wasn't for the fact that there was a growing resistance towards the deep state. Who could it be that has been trying to mount opposition to the deep state throughout history? Well, let's just put it like this. When the Hitler Project had served its purpose for the deep state, they manufactured the Cold War and the polarization between the West, capitalism, and the East, communism. This was done in order to get the general public's acceptance for further wars. The Nazis were used as the executive arm of the deep state at the start of the Second World War as their war machine. This then shifted to the US military. It truly is a sad story that the American people have been lured into fighting the deep state's wars for so long. There are probably forces inside the US military, and have been for a long time, that are not very happy about this. We won't venture into this side of things just yet, as we have only yet begun to describe the history of the deep state. Through the media, they drum up fear in the public's mind towards a certain entity. During the Cold War, the entity was communism, but the fear of communism itself wasn't big enough. In order to kickstart the Cold War, something big was needed. Enter the atom bomb. Like we said earlier, Jacob Schiff had financed the Russian-Japanese War through a man called Tokuhoshi Korekiyo, and the Emperor, Hirohito, was nothing more than a puppet for the deep state. The Central Bank of Japan was founded after the Meiji Restoration, a revolution in 1868, which restored imperial rule under the Japanese emperor. Revolution, establishment of a central bank, and installation of a dictator. Does this type of construction seem familiar? The Japanese Emperor, Hirohito, made sure to delay the ending of the Second World War, even though his generals wanted to surrender in 1944. Let's just put it like this. No atom bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No Cold War. How many of you have ever heard of a woman called Lyasee Meitner? Or the fact that she was the real person behind nuclear fission? Her nephew, Otto Robert Frisch, designed the first theoretical mechanism for the detonation of an atomic bomb in 1940. Without Lyasee Meitner, no Manhattan Project. Where did Lyasee Meitner perform her experiments? At Superfosfat AB, in Ljungbyhed, Sweden. This factory was owned by a company called Chemonobel, which by pure coincidence, was under the control of the Wallenberg family. Nobel Industries were in fact indicted in the Nuremberg trials, but the Wallenbergs, of course, were not. Later, when the facade of communism and the fear of the nuclear war no longer could be maintained, they shifted it to religion and the war against terrorism. When the entity of the day has served its purpose, the next one is introduced. When a single entity is not enough, they even use paralleled narratives. Nazism, communism, religion, terrorism, global warming, pandemics and the climate. All these different narratives are just mechanisms of furthering or maintaining their grip on civilization. The cost for the compounded interest, stemming from the creation of money, always keeps growing, so public consumption and government spending must always increase, in order to stop the deep state system from collapsing under its own weight. We're now at the end of the deep state system, and they have been stripped of control. There is an incoming paradigm shift, whether people understand it or not. For society to evolve, we must evolve as individuals. The only way for us to evolve is to first understand reality. To even begin to understand reality, we must understand our history. Our real history. Follow us into the next episode, where we continue to shine a light on historic events and individuals that are central to our real history. Thank you for listening.